What happens when a civilization disappears, not in war or flame, but in silence? I first asked that question as I stood among the broken bricks of a forgotten city, the wind whispering through what had once been the heart of the world's first civilization. No walls remained standing, no voices echoed in the streets, and yet something lingered just beneath the dust. This was Sumer, a land where the first cities rose from black soil, where temples touched the heavens, where gods were not distant but lived among the people. Here, writing was born, time was measured, stars were charted, laws were carved into stone. But how did it all begin? Who walked these ancient streets? And why, after such brilliance, did it all fade? In this journey, we will descend into buried archives and ruined ziggurats. We will unearth the secrets of a queen buried in gold, follow the trail of the world's oldest story, stand beside a temple that once breathed incense and blood, and finally, we will witness the slow unraveling of a language and a people. The Sumerians did not leave behind a single monument. They left behind an entire foundation. But to understand it, you must walk the path, through dust, through time, through memory. This is the rise and fall of Sumer, and you are the one who has just found the first clue. The boat slid quietly onto the bank, its reed hull brushing against the silt like a whisper. I stepped out, boots pressing into the black soil of southern Mesopotamia. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant reeds. Overhead, the sky was an endless sheet of pale gold, and ahead of me, nothing. No towers, no monuments, just cracked plains and the low hum of wind across an ancient land. But somewhere beneath my feet, beneath centuries of dust and flood and silence, lay Eridu, the first city. Older than legend, older than history as we define it. In the distance, half buried by time and shifting ground, the ruins rose in uneven mounds. Bricks of clay, sun-baked and humble, once formed temples. Homes, altars. Now they stood as earthen ghosts, waiting to be remembered. Eridu was not a metropolis of marble or conquest. It was a seed, planted by the hands of those who first asked the question, what if we stayed? What if we built something together? It began as a shrine, a place to speak with the gods, not to dominate, but to connect. Then came homes, then canals, then the shaping of land into law. The city was a prayer made permanent. The soil here is unlike anywhere else. Rich, dark, almost black, born from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates. It invited life, demanded it. And the Sumerians listened. They dug channels, planted barley, raised cattle. They worked not against the earth, but with it, in rhythm with its floods and seasons. Civilization didn't rise in opposition to nature. It rose in conversation with it. And here's the mystery that still stirs me. These people 5,000 or 6,000 years ago had no model to follow, no blueprint. Yet they created something entirely new, a city, not a village, not a camp, but a city with hierarchy, ritual, economy, and memory. They built it from the mud and mines alone. Every brick held purpose, every street a pattern, every temple a center. The more I walked the ruins, the more I realized it wasn't just that they built something, it was that they remembered it, passed it on, preserved it. Even as the city shifted and changed over centuries, its soul remained. Layer upon layer of rebuilding showed a continuity, a commitment. These were not transient people. They were rooted, and the roots ran deep. I found a shard of pottery near what had once been a threshold, decorated with geometric lines. Not elaborate, but deliberate. The hand that shaped it was steady, practiced. Somewhere in this dust, that potter had lived and laughed and likely never imagined their work would outlive them by thousands of years. But here it was, speaking softly. And perhaps that's what makes Eridu so haunting. Not its age, not even its scale, but its humility. It doesn't scream, it whispers. You have to listen close to hear it. The whisper says, "This is where we began. This is where the idea of living together truly began. No armies, no kings, not yet. Just people, choosing to build, choosing to stay." Standing there, I felt as though I had arrived at the start of something eternal, a spark in the vast dark. Eridu was not just the first city of Sumeru, it may have been the first city of all. And even now, under the silence and sand, it waits to be understood. The morning sun filtered through broken clouds as I brushed away the last layer of sediment. And there it was, a face carved in alabaster, buried for over 5,000 years. Smooth, stylized, and strangely serene. It wasn't human, not entirely. The eyes were wide, too wide. The lips closed in permanent silence. A god, or something once believed to be one. This fragment came from a temple wall near Eridu, just a few paces from where the foundations of the earliest shrines were laid. The Sumerians were not casual with their gods. Every carving, every symbol, every alignment of a building had purpose. To them, the divine was not some distant concept in the sky. It was present, living, real. It was in the rain, in the clay, in the flood, in the grain. The god whose face I found was likely Enki, a deity of water, wisdom, and creation. Patron of Eridu. He was said to live in the Abzu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth. To the Sumerians, the sacred didn't just descend from the heavens, it also welled up from below. Their temples were more than places of worship. They were the lungs of the city, breathing incense and prayer, hosting ritual, offering, and divine counsel. A temple wasn't just where humans spoke to gods, it was where gods lived. Literally, their statues were not symbolic. They were inhabited, fed, bathed, and dressed as if alive. And that belief wasn't limited to temples. It extended into the architecture of the world itself. A ziggurat wasn't merely a structure, it was a mountain of meaning, a tether between realms. Each level symbolized a cosmic layer, earth below, sky above, and the divine in between. To climb its steps was to ascend not just physically, but spiritually. The Sumerians saw the universe as ordered yet alive. The gods governed elements of life that we now measure with science. The moon was Nana, the sun was Utu, the storm was Ishkur. These weren't abstract forces. They had names, faces, relationships, and wills. And those wills could be influenced or angered. In the towns and cities, people left offerings, not just out of faith, but out of necessity. A failed harvest wasn't just bad luck. It meant that God was displeased. So you sang, you sacrificed. You aligned your building just right with the solstice or the river bend, hoping to keep the balance. When I stood beneath the remnants of a temple's collapsed lintel, I looked up and imagined what the Sumerians saw. Not empty sky, but a map of divine presence. Every star a messenger, every eclipse a warning. Their cosmology wasn't metaphorical, It was as practical as it was sacred. And yet, what's remarkable is how much of that sacred geometry still survives in our calendars, in our constellations, in the very idea that we are part of something bigger, something ordered, something watched. It's easy to dismiss ancient religion as myth, but when you run your hand across a carved votive or see the alignment of stones to the solstices, something shifts. These weren't primitive people afraid of the dark. They were observant, deliberate, and deeply attuned to the patterns that still shape us. In their world, the gods weren't just carved into stone. They were written into the sky, the rivers, the winds. They were present in every moment of life and every mystery of death. And standing in those ruined sanctuaries, where incense once rose in spirals and voices once filled the halls, I didn't feel alone. I felt watched, not by something malevolent, but by something ancient, something sacred, something remembered. I remember the moment clearly. In the cool hush of a ruined archive near Uruk, I lifted a clay tablet from the dust. It fit perfectly in my hand. The surface was uneven, but across it, a grid of wedge-shaped marks pressed deep with care and certainty. Cuneiform. The first writing, the first record, the first time a human voice reached across centuries and spoke. There was no ink, no parchment, just clay shaped while wet, then hardened by fire or sun. Each impression made by a reed stylus, straight lines, angled strokes, nothing ornamental, nothing wasted. It looked like code, like a sequence. And in a way, it was. Before cuneiform, memory was fragile, carried only in stories, passed mouth to mouth, vulnerable to the erosion of time. But here, in this simple tablet, someone had taken a thought and made it permanent, frozen in mud, preserved for the future. The tablet I held was a list: barley, goats, workers. But it was more than that. It was proof of a shift in consciousness. Writing didn't begin with poetry. It began with need, with the challenge of managing a city. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur. As these early cities grew, they demanded structure. They needed records, taxes, inventories, agreements. So the Sumerians began to inscribe the world, not just objects, but ideas, contracts, prayers, laws. Over time, cuneiform evolved. It became more than accounting. It carried myths, instructions, letters from kings, descriptions of the heavens, and eventually, stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the lamentations of priests, the songs of temple scribes. Through cuneiform, silence gave way to language, and language gave shape to time. Each sign was a choice, a decision, and each tablet a fragment of something larger, a network of memory. In some archives, tens of thousands of these clay documents were stacked like bricks, forming libraries of knowledge. In one temple school, I saw practice tablets from apprentice scribes, their marks shaky and uncertain. Even then, you could feel the weight of what they were learning, not just a script, but a technology of thought. The language itself wasn't Sumerian alone. Over centuries, Akkadian scribes used cuneiform, Babylonian kings, even Hittite diplomats. It spread like an idea too useful to remain in one place. And yet, despite its wide reach, its origin remains deeply Sumerian, born from mud and ingenuity. What astonishes me still is how much survived: fire, flood, conquest, and yet thousands of tablets remain, some cracked, some broken, but many whole, their words intact, their meanings deciphered only in the last 2 centuries. Imagine that. A civilization speaks, and we only begin to hear it thousands of years later. When I walk among the tablets, I feel something hum beneath the surface. Not just history, not just data, but presence, intention. Someone wanted to be remembered, someone wanted to communicate. And through these marks, they have. We take writing for granted now, but it began with clay, with reeds, with the slow, deliberate act of pressing thought into earth. And from that simple gesture, everything changed. Time itself could be captured. Not just the moment, but the memory of the moment. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing. They invented a way to resist forgetting, a way to echo across the ages. And as I stood in that chamber, the light catching the angled strokes of a 5,000-year-old message, I felt something profound. We were never meant to be silent. We were meant to leave traces. And the first of those traces were written in clay. In a quiet museum vault, away from the glass cases and guided tours, I was granted a rare moment. There, under dim conservation lights, lay 10 ancient tablets, baked clay, cracked, incomplete, but across each surface ran the unmistakable impressions of cuneiform. These were fragments of something greater, an epic, a story that had somehow survived the collapse of cities, the rise of empires, and the forgetting of languages. It was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Even the name felt heavy. Gilgamesh, a king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 man, a ruler, a warrior, a seeker. His tale, recorded more than 4,000 years ago, is the oldest surviving piece of literature we know, yet as I traced the lines of his story, it felt strangely modern, strangely personal. The tablets tell of a man who had everything: power, wealth, legacy. But he wanted more. He wanted meaning. He wanted to escape death, to conquer it. And so begins a journey, not of conquest, but of understanding. Gilgamesh's story is filled with gods and monsters, with cedar forests and immortal beings. But beneath the myth lies something achingly human. When his friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is shattered, not by the loss alone, but by the realization that he too will die, that even kings cannot escape the silence. So he wanders, across deserts, across mountains, across time, searching for the secret of eternal life. He finds Utnapishtim, a figure who survived the Great Flood and was granted immortality, and for a moment, it seems Gilgamesh might succeed. But he doesn't. He fails. The plant that grants youth is stolen. The gate to eternal life remains closed. And he returns to Uruk not as a god, but as a man who has seen the edge of all things. Standing there in the presence of those ancient tablets, I felt the weight of that ending. Not as a disappointment, but as a revelation. Gilgamesh did not win immortality, but he found something else. He saw his city again, its walls, its people, its beauty, and he realized this too is a kind of permanence. Not to live forever, but to be remembered. That, perhaps, is the echo that matters. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just a tale from the past. It is a mirror. It shows us the first time a human questioned the point of power, the weight of loss, the fear of death. These questions didn't begin in philosophy. They began in myth. in story, in clay. And for the Sumerians, this was not entertainment. This was sacred. This was survival. To speak of fear was to name it. To name it was to face it. I find it deeply moving that the world's oldest story is not about war or gold or glory. It is about grief, about a man who loved deeply, who lost deeply, and who, through that loss, became something more. We often think of ancient people as distant, as simple, but Gilgamesh reminds us that they were not so different. They feared what we fear. They hoped what we hope. And they wondered, as we still do, what comes after the final breath. That is why this story endures, not because it answers the question, but because it dares to ask it. And in the silence of the vault, with those tablets resting before me, I felt Gilgamesh, not as a myth, but as a voice, one that still speaks, one that still waits to be heard, an echo, not of a king, but of all of us. Night had just begun to fall when I reached the ruins of Ur. The wind was still, and the moon rose quietly over the distant Ziggurat, pale, round, watchful. It was the same moon they once watched, the same silver eye that lit their nights. And there, among the collapsed walls and broken thresholds of the temple dedicated to Nana, the moon god, I found something small but untouched by time. An ink pot, perfectly shaped, still holding traces of black pigment, nestled in the shadow of a shattered column. It had belonged to a scribe, not a warrior, not a priest, a writer, a keeper of time, a listener to the stars. The scribes of the Moon Temple were not ordinary men. They were trained from childhood, their hands taught to form cuneiform with precision, their minds sharpened by mathematics, by ritual, by the turning of the heavens. They wrote by oil lamp, under the breath of the night wind, surrounded by silence. Not silence of emptiness, but silence of purpose. Their task was immense. They recorded the phases of the moon, the appearances of Venus, the rising of stars just before dawn. To us, these may seem like simple notes, but to the Sumerians, they were divine messages, clues, patterns. The gods did not speak with voices. They moved through light and shadow, through numbers, through rhythm, and the scribes were their translators. I ran my fingers across the floor of the chamber and felt faint incisions in the stone. Not decorative, not random. A grid, a map of the sky. The temple had once been an observatory, long before telescopes. They used sight, repetition, patience. Night after night, these scribes documented the moon's path, searching for meaning in its phases and eclipses. For them, astronomy was not separate from religion, it was devotion. In one partially preserved archive room, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of tablets. Some were simple ledgers, others held lunar tables, predictions of eclipses, dates of festivals, the cycle of months. They had built a calendar not just to track days, but to align themselves with the sacred. Every decision, when to plant, when to harvest, when to marry, flowed from these observations. There's something deeply human in this, the desire to find order in the sky, to connect our lives to something larger, something eternal. And the scribes did not simply observe. They interpreted, they warned. A blood moon could signal a king's downfall. A rare conjunction might herald a shift in fortune. Their words shaped policy, shaped fear, shaped faith. But what struck me most was not just the intelligence behind their work, it was the quiet, the solitude. Imagine it, a boy grows into a man within temple walls, taught to listen, to calculate, to sit beneath the stars with a stylus in hand and no sound but the rustle of wind and the distant calls of jackals. His task is to witness, to preserve, to make the invisible visible. The Moon Temple was more than a building. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine, between night and understanding. And the scribes were its builders, not with stone, but with thought. When I left the ruins, the moon had risen higher. It cast a silver light over the broken stones, and for a moment I could almost see them. The scribes at their low tables, heads bowed, eyes lifted, writing the night into history. They are gone, but their words remain. Their sky remains, and in that they achieved something close to immortality. The wind shifted as I climbed the staircase, carrying with it the scent of dust and salt. Behind me, the plains of Nippur stretched wide and silent. Before me, the towering remains of a ziggurat reached skyward, its layers worn but still proud. Each step I took was uneven, time-worn but deliberate, as if the very act of climbing still mattered. The Sumerians built these great stepped structures, not as palaces, not as tombs, but as something far more mysterious. They called them mountain houses, sacred high places meant to bridge the earthly and the divine. And yet no one quite knows what happened at their summit. No tombs have been found. No altars remain, only the silence and the stairs. As I ascended, I imagined what it must have felt like thousands of years ago. The bricks beneath my feet were handmade, sun-dried, carefully laid in intricate patterns. They carried more than weight. They carried meaning. Every tier of the ziggurat represented a different level of existence. The underworld, the earthly realm, the heavens above. Climbing the staircase was not just physical. It was symbolic, a rising of the soul toward the sacred. Many ziggurats had 3 levels, some had 7. The higher you climbed, the closer you were to the gods. At the very top, there was often a small chamber, a shrine, reserved not for the public, not even for priests, but for the god, a place where the divine could descend and rest, or watch. But that is what makes these places so enigmatic. The structure is massive, the labor immense, and yet so little was meant to be used by humans. The staircase itself might have been ceremonial, or perhaps it was simply a path for ritual, a walk of humility, or power. I stood at the top, the wind stronger now, sweeping across the open platform. There was no roof, no inscription, only broken stone and sky. And yet, I felt something, a stillness, a presence, as if I had crossed into a space that was never meant to be permanent, only experienced. Some scholars believe the ziggurat was a cosmic model, a map of the universe. Others say it was a kind of stage, a place where priests performed rituals meant to echo through the heavens. Still others think it was a visual axis, meant to dominate the skyline and remind the people below of their place beneath the gods. But for me, the enigma is deeper. Why did they build so high only to leave it empty? Why so precise if it wasn't meant to be occupied? The ziggurat is both a question and a monument to that question, and perhaps that is the point. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the tiers below. From this height, I could see the remains of the city, the outlines of temples, homes, streets, all built in the ziggurat's shadow. It was not just the center of worship, it was the center of thought. The heart of the visible world reaching toward the invisible one. And as I began to descend, slowly, carefully, I felt I had passed through something sacred. Not a temple in the traditional sense, not a place filled with statues or gold, but a space built for something unspoken, a staircase that climbs to meaning. We may never know exactly what the ziggurat was meant to do, but its power remains. You feel it in the silence, in the height, in the echo of every step. It was built to reach something, and even now, long after its builders have vanished, it still does. I held it carefully between my fingers, no bigger than a thumb. A cylinder of stone, smooth along the sides, but etched with tiny, intricate images. Figures in procession. A lion, a robed man raising his hands, a star above them, a tree curling upward. This was not just art. This was a seal, a signature, a story. Cylinder seals were among the most personal objects in Sumerian life. They were carried, worn, passed down. Each one was unique. Rolled across wet clay, the seal would leave a repeating imprint, like a ribbon of meaning. This was how they signed contracts, closed containers, marked identity. But it was never just about function. It was about memory. The seal I found came from a burial site near Lagash. It was made of lapis lazuli, deep blue and cool to the touch. That alone told me the owner was someone of status. Lapis did not come from Sumer. It had to be brought across deserts and mountains, traded by hand over vast distances. The material mattered. The image mattered even more. Every line carved into the stone was deliberate. There was no wasted space, no randomness. These seals were made by master artisans, some of the most skilled in the ancient world. With tools of copper and flint, they worked stone as if it were soft. Under magnification, the details still hold. Tiny muscles, expressions, symbols we are still trying to fully understand. And what these seals depict is astonishing. Myth and ritual, commerce and conquest, offerings to gods, scenes of daily life. A cylinder seal was not just identification, it was a condensed autobiography, a declaration of who you were and what mattered most to you. Some belonged to merchants. Their seals showed ships, animals, trade goods. Others belonged to priests, etched with gods seated on thrones receiving gifts. Some depicted protective spirits. Some were covered in divine script. The seals were pressed into tablets to validate deals, secure property, or close messages. But they also carried power, spiritual power. To wear a seal was to be marked, guarded, recognized. I saw one seal in a museum archive that had belonged to a royal scribe. The image showed him standing between two gods, a stylus in his hand. He had carved himself into eternity, not as a warrior, not as a king, but as one who wrote, one who remembered. There's something deeply moving about that. In today's world, we leave signatures on screens, on forms, without thought. But the Sumerians made their marks permanent, pressed into clay, hardened by fire. And the clay, forgotten in archives or buried in earth, endured. Thousands of these impressions have survived. They tell us of marriages, inheritances, prayers, orders, beliefs. But more than anything, they tell us that even at the dawn of civilization, people wanted to be seen, to be known, to be part of something that would outlast them. When I rolled the seal I found across fresh clay, the imprint appeared instantly. After thousands of years, its story emerged again, clean, precise, alive. And in that moment, I understood something. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing, they invented permanence. They understood that memory is fragile, that lives no matter how full can vanish. So they carved themselves into stone, into clay, into history. A cylinder seal may be small, but it carries the weight of a lifetime, and when pressed into the earth, it becomes a voice, one that says, "I was here, and this was my world." The room was dim and cold. The museum lights were soft, angled downward, as if afraid to disturb what sat beneath them. At the center of the case, resting on a felt cushion, was a single fragment of clay, cracked, hardened, covered in the same ancient wedges I had come to know so well. But this one was different. This one spoke of a flood. This was Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the so-called Flood Tablet. And as I read the translation beside it, a chill ran through me. The words echoed something I had known since childhood: a massive flood sent by the gods, wiping clean the face of the earth. One man warned in time builds a boat, gathers animals, survives the storm, sends out birds, finds dry land. But this was not the Bible. This story was older, centuries older. The Sumerians recorded it in clay long before it was inked into parchment. And that begs the question, where did this story truly begin? In the story, the flood is not just a natural disaster, it is a divine decision. The gods, displeased with humanity, choose to erase their creation, but one man, Utnapishtim, is chosen to survive. His boat is immense, built to specific measurements, sealed with pitch. When the flood waters rise, they consume everything. When they fall, a new world begins. It is hauntingly familiar. What struck me most as I stood there was not the detail of the myth, but the emotion in it, the sorrow, the regret. Utnapishtim is not triumphant. He is burdened. He lives forever, but in exile. His story is a warning, not a celebration. And it raises a deeper question. Was there a flood? Archaeological layers at sites like Shurapak and show sudden deposits of silt, clean flood-borne clay, sandwiched between layers of human habitation, evidence of major water events. But no one knows for sure if it was one massive flood or many, regional, seasonal, yet unforgettable. What matters more, perhaps, is that the memory of it endured, not in numbers, but in story. The Sumerians passed it down, not as a weather report, but as a moral, a message. Catastrophe is part of the human experience. It comes suddenly, without fairness, without explanation, and what matters is how we survive it, how we remember it. The flood became more than an event. It became a symbol of endings, of clean slates, of punishment and grace. And through the Epic of Gilgamesh, that symbol reached beyond Sumer, into Babylon, into Canaan, into every culture that watched rivers rise and wondered if the gods were angry. And still today, when waters rise, when disaster strikes, we tell stories, we rebuild, we try to understand. The flood, in its many forms, still returns. When I looked again at the tablet, the careful strokes, the compact lines, I imagined the scribe who wrote it, seated on a temple floor, stylus in hand, clay cooling quickly. Did he know the weight of what he was preserving? Did he understand that his story would cross centuries and continents? Or was he simply recording what he had been told, what he could not forget? The Flood Tablet is not just a tale of destruction. It is a reminder of how memory works, how fear becomes myth, how myth becomes warning. The flood may have passed, the city may be gone, but the story remains, pressed in clay, read by firelight, whispered across time. It tells us what the Sumerians feared, what they endured, and how even in ruin, they chose to remember. The chamber was silent when they opened it. Buried beneath the ancient city of Ur, beneath layers of brick and dust and forgotten names, lay a tomb untouched for more than 4,000 years. Inside, the remains of a woman, her bones delicate, her posture composed, her name pressed into a small cylinder seal beside her head was Puabi. Queen Puabi, not the wife of a king, not a consort, a ruler in her own right. Her title was not queen as we use it today. It was Nin, a word meaning lady, priestess, or sovereign, depending on how it was read. But the gold left no doubt. She had power, and that power followed her into death. Her headdress alone was a marvel. Rows of golden leaves, shaped like poplar and willow, layered in an almost celestial pattern. Thick ribbons of beaten gold crowned her brow. Lapis lazuli and carnelian beads hung from her ears. The craftsmanship was not just ornamental, it was symbolic, a blend of beauty and belief. But it was not the gold that shocked the excavators. It was what surrounded her. Dozens of attendants, men and women, lined along the walls, some musicians, still clutching their instruments, others, guards or servants, all laid to rest with her, not buried later, not after, but at the same time, as if accompanying her into the next world. Their skeletons were orderly, peaceful. Some had small cups near them, hinting at poison. Others bore signs of a gentle, deliberate death. There was no violence, no panic, only stillness. It was as if the tomb was a ritual, a final court assembled for eternity. And that is where the mystery deepens. Why would so many die with one woman? Was it duty? Belief? Was it forced? Or voluntary? Some scholars suggest it was a sacred act, a transition between worlds that required accompaniment. Others believe it was political, a display of control and divinity. But when I stood at the edge of a replica of that tomb, the silence was overwhelming. I imagined the flicker of oil lamps, the scent of incense, the slow procession of people who had served her in life, now preparing to follow her in death. There was reverence in it, but also something unknowable, something heavy. Puabi's burial was unlike any other found in Sumer. It was lavish, yes, but also intimate. Her body was carefully arranged, her ornaments placed with precision. This was not just a queen being honored. This was a woman being remembered. And she was remembered. Her seal, when rolled across clay, showed her name boldly. No mention of a husband, no mention of a king, just Puabi, a name, a title, a legacy. We often think of ancient women as hidden, passive, silent, but Queen Puabi defies that idea. She was visible, commanding, celebrated, and when she died, an entire ceremonial world was built around her, one that speaks volumes, even if the language is still partly lost. As I looked at her jewelry, now housed behind glass, I thought about how much meaning we place in gold. To the Sumerians, it was not just wealth. It was divine, eternal, untarnished, a material fit for gods and for those who walked beside them. Puabi's tomb is not just a burial site. It is a statement about power, about memory, about the strange, beautiful rituals we craft to face the final unknown. In death, she became more than a queen. She became a symbol, a golden echo of a forgotten sovereignty. and though her court has long turned to dust, her presence remains, quiet, regal, undimmed. It was deep within a forgotten chamber near the ancient city of Lagash that I found it, a broken vessel, cracked but unmistakable in its shape, wide at the top, narrowing at the base, with a single small hole near the bottom, a water clock, or what the Sumerians might have called a clepsydra, a machine of time made not of gears and springs, but of clay, gravity, and silence. The concept was simple. You filled it with water. As it drained, you marked the passing moments. No ticking, no bells, just the steady drip of time dissolving into the earth. But for the Sumerians, this was more than a tool. It was a bridge, a way to capture the intangible and give it form. They used these clocks in temples, in courts, and in observatories, and always with purpose. The measurement of time was sacred. It told them when to pray, when to plant, when to prepare for the shifting moods of the gods. In Sumer, time was not a concept. It was a pattern, something to observe, something to respect. Beside the remnants of the clepsydra, I found something else, a tablet half buried in the stone dust. When cleaned, it revealed a grid of symbols, faint but unmistakable. Stars, constellations, the tracking of celestial bodies, a star map. These were not decorative. They were observational records, kept by temple scribes who watched the sky every night. With no telescopes, no modern instruments, they used only their eyes, their memories, and their clay tablets, and yet they could predict eclipses. They knew the cycle of Venus. They named the paths of the sun and moon across the heavens. Imagine them, seated on rooftops in the heat of summer, styluses in hand, charting the positions of stars. Their notes were meticulous, aligned to seasons, matched to floods, matched to fate. What amazed me most was how accurate they were. In some cases, these early astronomers calculated lunar months within a margin of error so small it rivals what we can do with mechanical watches. Not because they were guessing, but because they were watching constantly. To the Sumerians, time was not just hours and days. It was cosmic. The gods moved in cycles. The universe itself was a clock, and the stars were not random. They were messages. Some tablets showed lists of omens tied to the appearance or disappearance of certain stars. If this star rises at dawn, war may come. If that planet lingers too long, crops might fail. It was not science as we understand it today, but it was a deep and structured attempt to read the universe, to understand its rhythms. They believed that by observing the sky, they could glimpse the will of the gods, and by measuring time with water, they could anchor themselves within that divine order. When I stepped back from those objects, the clock, the map, the tablet, I realized I was looking at a kind of time machine, not one that carried them into the future, but one that let them hold the present and see the past. We often think of ancient people as living in darkness, but they were obsessed with light, with cycles, with precision. They did not drift through time. They measured it, shaped it, and in doing so, they made themselves part of it. The water clock drips, the stars move. And through those movements, the Sumerians learned something essential. That time is not a straight line. It is a pattern, a dance, a rhythm. And they, like us, were always trying to find their place in it. The wind swept across the empty plain where a city once stood. Nothing remained but scattered shards and fragments of walls worn down to their foundations. But as I traced the edge of a trench left by earlier excavations, I caught sight of something buried beneath the compacted soil. A circular imprint, smooth in one arc, ribbed in another. It was part of a wheel, spoked and reinforced. A chariot wheel. Long before the great empires of Egypt or Rome made them famous, the Sumerians had already begun experimenting with this powerful invention. They were among the first to shape the wheel not just for carts or plows, but for war. The earliest Sumerian chariots were crude by later standards, heavy, made of wood and leather, pulled by donkeys, not horses. But they were fast compared to marching infantry, and they carried warriors armed with spears, axes, or javelins. These were not machines of conquest alone. They were symbols of status, of innovation, of fear. I found a depiction of one carved into a limestone relief, its rider holding reins in one hand and a weapon in the other. Beside him, a soldier stood ready. The scene was tense, movement frozen in stone, but you could feel it, the weight, the speed, the impact. And at the heart of it all was bronze. The Sumerians were among the first to work with this new metal, a mixture of copper and tin, harder than stone, more durable than bone or wood. Bronze changed everything. Tools cut deeper, axes shattered shields, spears pierced farther. It turned farming communities into fortified cities. It turned ritual combat into organized war. I visited a weapons cache once, tucked inside the ruins of a military quarter near Kish. Rows of bronze blades, maces, arrowheads, each one shaped with care. Balanced, sharpened, they were not mass-produced. Each weapon had a maker, a purpose, a hand behind it. War, for the Sumerians, was not just about land. It was about control of water, of trade routes, of divine favor. Cities like Lagash, Umma, and waged constant battles over canals and boundaries. The gods themselves were said to choose sides. Temples became arsenals, kings became generals. The city-states of Sumer, once centers of trade and writing, became theaters of strategy and siege. One inscription, carved into a stone stele, described a campaign in vivid detail: the march, the battle, the taking of captives, the offerings to the gods afterward. War was sacred, it was brutal, it was political, and it was everywhere. And yet, for all its violence, there was something deeply organized about it. This was not chaos. This was calculated, structured, fought with formations and tactics, chariots to break lines, archers to soften defenses, infantry to hold ground. Even the gods of Sumer had weapons, Inanna with her war net. As I walked the empty field where battles once raged, I thought about the silence, the contrast. Thousands of years ago, this place would have echoed with drums, with hooves, with shouts and steel. Now, it was wind, just wind. But the memory of bronze still lingers, in the broken blades, in the bent wheels, in the way we still shape metal for power. The Sumerians gave the world its first glimpse of industrialized conflict. Not random violence, but war with rules, with machines. And in that march of bronze, they left more than scars on the land. They left a blueprint for victory, for loss, for the terrible brilliance of human invention when turned toward war. It was at the edge of the sacred precinct in that I first saw it, a fragment of black stone worn by centuries, its surface etched with deep, purposeful marks. At first glance, it looked like many other ancient tablets. But the more I studied it, the more I realized what I was holding. It was part of a law code, and not the famous one from Babylon, but something older. This was the Code of Ur-Nammu. Nearly 3 centuries before Hammurabi carved his laws into stone, the Sumerians had already begun shaping order out of chaos. Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, ruled during what many call the Sumerian Renaissance, a time of cultural revival, architectural flourish, and legal innovation. His code, written in Sumerian cuneiform, is the earliest known legal text we have ever uncovered. And it begins not with threats, but with clarity. Its opening lines are not about punishment, they are about justice, about a world where fairness is not left to chance or the whims of power. When Enlil gave kingship to Ur-Nammu, it says, he established equity in the land. It is a declaration that the king's role was not to dominate, but to balance. The laws themselves are surprisingly practical. They cover theft, assault, marriage, inheritance, but also matters of trade, slavery, and debt. What is remarkable is the tone, measured, almost rational. Penalties are outlined, but not always brutal. Many offenses are resolved with fines, others with restitution. The aim seems less about fear and more about structure. One law reads, if a man knocks out the tooth of another man, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. Another, if a man divorces his wife without cause, he shall pay her compensation. These are not arbitrary edicts. They are attempts to weigh action against consequence, to define what is fair. I stood before a replica of the full code once, its tall stone surface like a dark mirror. There were no illustrations, no divine figures carved into the top like on Hammurabi's stele, just text, line after line, law after law. It felt less like a command from the heavens and more like a contract between people, and that may be what makes it so profound. The Code of Ur-Nammu was likely displayed in public, not hidden in palaces, not locked in temples. Its purpose was not secrecy. It was visibility. Everyone, farmer, merchant, priest, would know the rules, would know their rights, and that in itself is revolutionary. In a world where power often flowed from sword and shrine, the idea of a written, consistent law was a kind of miracle. Of course, justice in ancient Sumer was not equal in the modern sense. Punishment still varied by status. Slaves were treated differently than free men. Women had fewer protections in some areas. But within its own time, the code stood as a new kind of foundation, a step away from vengeance and toward order. And perhaps most importantly, it set a precedent. When later rulers carved their own laws into stone, they followed the path Ur-Nammu had begun. The idea that a ruler should not just conquer, but legislate. That society should be shaped not only by faith and fear, but by shared understanding. As I traced the final lines of the fragment with my light, I thought about how strange it is that fairness has a history, that even in the dust of a forgotten kingdom, someone once believed that justice could be written, preserved, shared. The Code of Ur-Nammu may be cracked and incomplete, but its message still speaks, not with fire and fury, but with quiet conviction that civilization is not born from stone alone, but from the choices we agree to make together. The air was heavy as I stepped through the shattered doorway of the temple. The stone still held heat from the day, but something else lingered in the space. A scent, faint but unmistakable. Resin, burned long ago. It clung to the walls like memory, as if the temple itself had exhaled one final breath of incense and then gone still. This was Eshnuna, Once a vibrant city-state of ancient Sumer, its temples rose not just as places of worship, but as the very heart of its spiritual and political life. Here, gods were not distant, they were residents, and their homes, these temples, were alive with song, with offerings, with ritual, and sometimes with sacrifice. I walked past the remnants of an altar, scorched at the edges, blackened by use. Offerings had been placed here for centuries. Grain, oil, beer, sheep. In the beginning, these gifts were meant to nourish the gods, to honor them, to ask for protection, favor, rain, fertility. But over time, the offerings grew more serious. Tablets recovered from temple storerooms describe rituals in careful detail, how animals were inspected, bathed, presented, how the priests would speak the invocations, and how the blood would flow not with violence, but with ceremony. Everything was ritualized. Everything had meaning. The Sumerians believed the gods needed to be fed, not just with food, but with devotion, with life. And in extreme cases, that devotion took darker forms. In the corner of a shrine chamber, I found a pit, shallow, stone-lined, with faint stains still visible in the floor. Whether animal or human, I cannot say. But the energy of the place was undeniable. Not evil, not cruel, but powerful. Like a doorway once opened and never fully closed. And yet, it wasn't all blood. Temples were also filled with light, with fragrance, with color. They were painted, carved, inlaid with precious stones. Statues of gods stood tall in the sanctum, clothed in fine fabric, adorned with jewelry, their eyes made of shell and lapis lazuli. They were treated not as symbols, but as living beings. Priests bathed them, fed them, sang to them. The temple was not a building, it was a body. Every room, an organ, every ritual, a breath. There were temples to Inanna, goddess of love and war, to Enlil, the god of storms and kingship, to Nana, the moon god, whose temple in Ur still rises against the desert sky. Each one unique, each one alive with its own rhythm, its own sacred geometry. Outside, people gathered. Markets bustled near the temple gates. Festivals unfolded in the plazas. The temple was not removed from life, it was at the center of it. It dictated calendars, contracts, and celebrations. It fed the poor. It employed scribes, musicians, and cooks. It was the beating heart of the city. And yet, for all its generosity, it demanded something in return: faith, obedience, reverence, sometimes sacrifice. As I stepped out into the fading light, the last of the sun touched the temple's highest stone. I looked back at its silhouette and I understood this was not a place of comfort. It was a place of power, a place where gods and humans met, not as equals, but as participants in an ancient transaction. Incense and blood, beauty and fear, hope and surrender. The temple was not merely where gods lived, it was where people remembered how small they truly were, and where they tried, through ritual, through offering, through prayer, to touch something vast and eternal. I was deep within the lower layers of the tell at Kish when I noticed something strange, a shift. The tablets, still dense with cuneiform, had changed. The symbols looked the same at first glance, but as I read the translations, the words no longer belonged to the Sumerians. They were Akkadian, a Semitic language. The voice on the clay was different. This was not a mistake. It was a transition. A quiet vanishing. Somewhere around the start of the second millennium before the Common Era, the Sumerian language began to fade. Slowly, softly, not through war, not through edict, but through change, through time. Sumerian is the oldest known written language in the world. It has no known relatives, no linguistic cousins. It stands alone like a solitary tree in a field of younger growth. It was once the language of priests and kings, of merchants and astronomers, of poets and scribes. It was used to build cities, write laws, and sing to the gods. And then, gradually, it disappeared. Akkadian rose in its place, a language closer to Hebrew and Arabic, more flexible in speech, more widespread through trade and empire. Scribes began writing in Akkadian while still using Sumerian forms. Bilingual tablets became common, but eventually even those stopped. By the time of Hammurabi, Sumerian was no longer spoken on the street, no longer heard in the market or sung in lullabies. It became a ceremonial language preserved only in temples and schools, a sacred tongue, a scholar's script. Like Latin today, it survived not through the tongue, but through the pen. I found a tablet in one of those old scribal schools filled with lists. A student had been copying Sumerian vocabulary into Akkadian, line by line, word by word, practicing, translating, learning a language already on the edge of silence. It was humbling to see that effort, to witness someone, thousands of years ago, trying to hold on to a world already slipping away. Language is more than words, it is memory. It is how we see, how we feel, how we connect. When a language vanishes, it takes with it a way of being, a way of thinking. The Sumerians had words that do not translate easily into modern tongues, words for the sacred resonance of a temple drum, for the exact kind of canal that curved through barley fields, for emotions that were part prayer, part law, part poem. What happens when those words go silent? We are left with clay, with fragments, with echoes. And yet, the language did not vanish entirely. For centuries after it fell out of common use, scribes continued to study it. They revered it, they copied it, not because they still spoke it, but because they knew it mattered. It had shaped the world they inherited. Even today, when scholars read a Sumerian hymn or decode a royal inscription, they are not just translating, they are reviving a voice that has not been heard in 3,000 years. They are breathing life into silence. As I sat beside those tablets in the dust of a crumbled city, I thought about how strange and beautiful it is that words written in mud can outlive the mouths that once spoke them. That even when the language itself disappears, its spirit can remain. The Sumerian tongue is no longer spoken, but it is not forgotten. It waits. In libraries, in ruins, in the minds of those who still chase the first syllables of civilization. And in that waiting, it still speaks. The canal was dry, cracked, its bed, once alive with water and trade, now stretched before me like a scar through the earth. I stood on what had once been a lifeline, a ribbon of civilization, but now it whispered only one word: gone. The fall of Sumer did not come with fire. It did not crumble overnight. There was no single moment when it all ended, no last battle, no final decree. Instead, it came with wind, with drought, with dust, and with salt. For centuries, the Sumerians had mastered their environment. They built canals, managed floods, turned desert into farmland. But the very tools that had brought life began to bring decay. Over time, the irrigation systems, while ingenious, caused something unexpected. Salt from the rising groundwater slowly poisoned the soil. Crop yields declined. Fields once golden with barley turned white and brittle. The rivers changed course. Floods became unpredictable. Storms returned more fiercely. Some years brought no rain at all. Others brought too much. Cities struggled to maintain balance. People moved, some northward, some into rising powers like Akkad and later Babylon. And slowly, the old ways faded. The language changed, the gods shifted, the ziggurats stood, but the voices around them grew fewer. Temples were emptied, markets grew quiet, and the great cities, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, became bones in the sand. It was not war that erased them, it was time, and the land itself. But even as the cities emptied, their memory remained. Later kings still called themselves kings of Sumer and Akkad. They knew what had come before. They knew it mattered. Clay tablets continued to be copied. Names continued to be remembered. But the civilization itself was gone. I walked through the ruins of Ur just after dawn, the light catching the corners of broken walls and scattered bricks. It felt impossible to imagine what it had once been. Music, laughter, the scent of bread, the sound of prayers drifting upward from temple courtyards. Now, only wind. The structures may be broken, but their lines still hold. The streets still follow patterns. The ziggurat still casts a shadow. The past is not buried, it is exposed, quiet, waiting. I found a tablet near a fallen wall, shattered into pieces. It was a ledger, names of workers, rations, days counted and recorded. Nothing dramatic, just the details of life. But in those numbers, in that routine, I saw the heartbeat of a people who lived with intention, with rhythm, with purpose. The fall of Sumer is not just a historical event, it is a warning, a reminder. Civilizations do not always end in flames. Sometimes they fade, inch by inch, choice by choice, until the silence becomes permanent. And yet, there is beauty in that silence, in what remains, in the fact that thousands of years later, we can still stand in their streets, still read their words, still feel the weight of what they built. The dust carries their stories, the salt marks their lessons, the silence holds their truths. The Sumerians were not forgotten. They were found, piece by piece, word by word. And in every brick we touch, every tablet we read, we do not just remember them, we continue them. As I look back across the fragments, the ruins, and the quiet spaces where cities once breathed, I realized the Sumerians were not just the first civilization, they were the first to ask what it means to be one. They gave us cities, not just clusters of homes, but living networks of law, worship, trade, and memory. They gave us writing not to entertain, but to account, to remember, to endure. They watched the stars not with wonder alone, but with discipline. Their calendars guided crops. Their stories shaped kings. They built with mud, but dreamed in eternity. When we speak of Sumer, we are not just remembering a people, we are remembering a beginning. The first time humans gathered in great numbers and chose to live with structure, the first time the sky was charted as a system, the first time a law was written, a prayer recorded, a story preserved. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Sumerians remind us of something deeper, that even the greatest achievements can be lost, that no civilization, no matter how mighty, escapes the pull of time. They faded not with violence, but with slow erosion of land, of language, of influence. But they did not vanish, because we found them. In the clay, in the script, in the long, slow uncovering of names once thought to be myth, Gilgamesh, Puabi, Ur-Nammu. These are not just characters in ancient texts. They were real. They walked the same earth, looked at the same moon. Their world was different, but their questions were not. Who are we? Why are we here? How do we live together? And how do we endure? The Sumerians do not answer those questions for us, but they were the first to ask them in a language we can still read. And maybe that is their greatest legacy, that across 5,000 years their voice still rises, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to remind us that history does not whisper, it waits.